Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I am, by nature, the kind of person who notices things, not in a way I've ever considered a particular gift, more a baseline condition, a persistent low-level attentiveness to detail that makes me good at certain kinds of work and slightly exhausting to spend extended time with, according to people who have spent extended time with me. I notice when furniture has been moved and when someone has changed their part and when the usual order of things has been quietly disrupted. I notice these things automatically, without deciding to, the way some people hear pitch and some people read rooms. I register detail and I hold it and I compare it against prior registrations without any particular effort. This is the thing that made what happened with Cale visible to me when it was invisible to everyone else. Kel Marsh moved in next door 4 years ago. The house had been empty for several months between its previous owner and Cale, long enough that his arrival was a mild event on the street, the way any new neighbor is a mild event, a brief period of calibration as everyone adjusts their sense of the block to incorporate a new element. He was somewhere in his early 40s, dark-haired, medium height and build, the kind of person who reads as unremarkable in the best way, the neighbor who is pleasant at the mailbox and unobtrusive the rest of the time. He kept his yard in reasonable order. He drove a dark blue sedan that he parked in the driveway. He had no visitors I was aware of and no apparent routine that departed significantly from the standard rhythms of a working adult living alone. I built up a picture of him the way I build up pictures of everything, passively and without intention. Detail accumulating into baseline the way sediment accumulates into ground. The scar on his left forearm, visible when he wore short sleeves, a long-heeled thing with the silvered quality of an old injury. The way he held his coffee cup in the morning, both hands regardless of the temperature. The small dent in the rear bumper of the blue sedan that had been there since he arrived and that he'd never had repaired. A particular set of wind chimes on his back porch that I could hear faintly from my own yard on quiet evenings. A sound I'd become so accustomed to that I had stopped registering it, except as part of the general ambient texture of home. These are small things. I want to be clear that I understand they're small things, that a different person wouldn't have assembled this catalogue and therefore would have had nothing to compare against when the first reset happened. The scar was the first thing I noticed. It happened about 14 months after Cale moved in. We'd been having a warm spell in September, and he was out in his yard in a short-sleeved shirt, and I looked at his forearm the way you automatically look at a familiar feature of a familiar person, and the scar was wrong. Not absent, not different in shape or location, just more prominent than it had been. The silvered old injury quality it had developed over the months I'd known him replaced by something closer to the way a scar looks before time has fully worked on it, more visible, less settled into the skin. I noticed it at the way you notice a word that's been spelled wrong after you've read it correctly 100 times. The wrongness registering before the conscious identification of what specifically was wrong. I dismissed it, which is the appropriate response to a scar looking slightly different on a given morning. Lighting conditions, viewing angle, the variability of human skin, and human observation. I noted it and let it go. The second thing was the mannerism. Cale had a habit, developed sometime in his second year next door, of running his thumb along the edge of whatever he was holding while he talked. A small unconscious gesture that I'd watched develop gradually from something he didn't do into something he did consistently, and then into something he did without awareness. Then, around the same time as the scar incident, the gesture disappeared. Not faded the way habits fade when people work to break them, gone cleanly, returned to the baseline of someone who had never developed it. I stood at my kitchen window watching him talk to the mail carrier and noticed the absence of the gesture and felt something I want to be precise about. Not alarm, not fear. Something more like the specific disorientation of an equation that no longer balances, a result that doesn't follow from the inputs in any way I could account for. I started paying deliberate attention, which is different from the passive attention I'd been paying before. Deliberate attention has a quality of intention that changes what you find because you're looking for specific things rather than simply receiving what's there. What I found over the following months was more resets, enough of them that the word reset became the word I used for it in my own thinking, the most accurate available description of what I was observing, a periodic return to an earlier state of several specific details simultaneously. The photograph in the windowsill of his front room, visible when the light was right and the angle cooperated, had changed in his second year from a landscape to something with people in it, a change I'd noted without interest because people redecorate and rotate their photographs. The people photograph disappeared and the landscape came back around the same time as the scar and the mannerism, and the landscape that came back was the same landscape that had been there when he moved in. Not a different one, but the same image in what appeared to be the same frame. A conversation about a month into my deliberate observation in which I referenced something we discussed the previous spring. A specific conversation about the street's history that we'd had over the fence one afternoon and that I could recall in reasonable detail. Cale looked at me with the attentiveness of someone following along, and at the right moment said something that made clear he didn't have the conversation, not in the way of forgetting it, but in the way of someone receiving a reference to an event that wasn't in their experience of the world. No the way you were saying quality, no comfortable familiarity with the reference, just the slightly more effortful engagement of someone processing new information rather than recalled information. I tracked the cycle across 8 months of deliberate observation and found it ran approximately every 4 to 5 months. A period of normal neighbor life, Cale going about his days in the ordinary rhythms I'd established as his baseline, and then a 3-day absence, the house dark and the car gone and no response to the street's ambient social interactions, and then his return in a state that corresponded to an earlier version of the baseline in every detail I was tracking. The details I'd watched develop over months returned to their pre-development state, the accumulated small changes of a human life moving through time quietly reversed. I want to be honest that I spent time trying to build a framework that made this ordinary before I accepted that ordinary wasn't available. I tried medical explanations, conditions that produce memory discontinuity or behavioral regression, and none of them touched the physical details, the scar, the photograph, the dent in the bumper that came and went and came back. I tried the explanation that I was simply wrong, that my observations were less reliable than I believed them to be, and I tested this by keeping written notes with dates and found that the notes confirmed rather than corrected my observations. I tried coincidence and found coincidence couldn't account for the simultaneity of the resets, the way multiple details return to their earlier state together rather than independently. I found the previous address through public records which are available if you know where to look and are willing to spend the time looking. Cale's record before our street had gaps in it that I won't describe in full detail because the specifics are less important than the general shape, which was this: the person on paper who had lived at that address was continuous in some respects and not in others. The continuity of a record that had been assembled to pass casual inspection rather than to withstand the kind of scrutiny I was applying. The woman who had lived next door to Cale's previous address was named Dora, and I found her through a neighborhood review platform, one of those hyper-local community sites where residents post about local issues and occasionally about neighbors. Her posts about Kale were several years old and were the posts of someone who had tried to articulate something and had found the articulation landing badly with the people who responded, the posts garnering the kind of replies that community forums give to things they've decided are the concerns of someone who needs to worry less. She'd eventually stopped posting, and her account had gone quiet. I sent her a message. She called me rather than writing back, which told me something about how she'd decided to handle this kind of communication after the forum experience. And she talked for a long time with the specific quality of someone who has been holding something unsaid for years and has now found a recipient they believe might actually receive it. Her account predated mine by 3 years. The same pattern, the same cycle, the same resets. She'd tracked it less systematically than I had, but had reached the same conclusions through accumulated observation. She described the scar, which she'd also noticed. She described a mannerism she'd watched develop and disappear. She described conversations that he hadn't remembered having. She'd moved, she said. Not because of Cale specifically. She'd given herself other reasons that were also true and that she'd allowed to be sufficient because the alternative was staying next door to something she couldn't name and couldn't report and couldn't make anyone else see. She asked me if I was going to move. I told her I hadn't decided yet. She said she understood and that she hoped I wouldn't wait as long as she had. The reset I watched in October was the clearest one I'd observed since beginning my deliberate tracking. Cale left on a Tuesday, the blue sedan gone from the driveway before I was awake Wednesday morning, the house dark and still through Wednesday and Thursday. I know how this sounds, that I was watching my neighbor's house, and I want to be clear that watching is not precisely what I was doing, more that I maintained a peripheral awareness of a space I'd been peripherally aware of for 4 years, but that peripheral awareness had become deliberate in a way that I'd stopped pretending was ordinary neighborly attentiveness. He came back Friday afternoon. I was in the front yard when he pulled into the driveway, and he got out of the car and raised a hand in greeting, and I stood there, and looked at him in the particular way I'd learned to look at him over months of deliberate observation. The scar was back, the same prominence it had had when I'd first noticed the reset 14 months ago. The same pre-settled quality, as though the skin had been returned to a point before time had continued working on it. The dent in the rear bumper was gone. I looked at the bumper, and the bumper was clean and undamaged, in a way it had not been for 4 years. The small familiar dent I'd stopped seeing because I'd always seen it simply absent. The car returned to the condition it had been in before whatever minor incident had produced the dent, which should have been impossible if the car was the same car. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table and thought about Dora and the forum posts that nobody had taken seriously and the years she'd spent next door before she'd given herself other reasons to move. I listed the house 2 weeks later. On my last day, the moving truck loading and the neighbors doing the street's version of a farewell. Cale came over. He was in the version of himself that the most recent reset had produced, the one I'd been watching for the past month. And he was warm and appropriately regretful about my leaving, and he said the things that neighbors say on the last day, that the street wouldn't be the same, that he hoped I'd found somewhere good to land. I shook his hand. In the handshake, in the fraction of a second that the physical contact produced, he looked at me differently. Not the version of Cale I'd been watching for a month, not the reset iteration or any of the previous ones. Something underneath those, looking out from a place that was further back than any of the states I'd been tracking, through eyes that were present and aware in a way that none of the iterations had been in any of our previous interactions. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the handshake ended, and the expression was gone, and Cale, as he currently was, said it had been good having me as a neighbor and went back to his yard. I drove away behind the moving truck, and I've been in my new place for 3 weeks now, and the neighbors here are people I've met twice, once briefly at the mailbox and once through the window. And I'm building baselines for them, the way I build baselines for everything, passively and without intention, detail accumulating into ground. I haven't stopped noticing. I'm not capable of not noticing. It's just what I do. What I'm doing differently is this. I'm letting more things go. The slight inconsistency in the man across the street, the thing I half noticed at the mailbox last week, and that flickered at the edge of my attention for a moment before I moved on. I let that go. I filed it as lighting conditions and kept walking. I don't know if that's wisdom or the thing that happens to you when you've seen what I've seen and decided that not seeing is a survivable option in a way that seeing clearly is not. I think about Cale's expression in the handshake, the thing looking out from behind the surface of the person that had been maintained next door for 4 years and reset periodically and maintained again. Whatever the original was, wherever it was being kept while the iterations ran next door, it was still there in the moment of contact, still present, still aware, still in there, looking out. I don't know if that's worse than it not being there at all. I think on most days that it probably is.